Hi everyone, this is Fabio Escobar, the first of my mini lectures for this class. I'll be doing these every week for just a few minutes at a time, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, no more than that. Just want to give you a sense of what's in store for you. The class will work according to these mini lectures if you choose to listen to them, or just according to the readings. We have a very basic format. We read, we come together to discuss, and we write a weekly paper. That's the entire class, in fact. All you have to be responsible for is being prepared to have a discussion in class on the readings, and afterward writing a short paper, a 1 to 2 page paper on the reading and our discussion. So your responsibility is obviously to be there, to be on time, to be prepared, and to be as attentive as possible in the span of that 90-minute session that we will have every week. This is a hybrid class, which means that you're going to be asked to do some work online, and we do that through Blackboard at blackboard.ecc.edu. You can also access Blackboard through myecc.ecc.edu. You will use your ECC login and password to access those resources. You must know those login and password in order to access the resources. And if you don't know them, talk to me and I'll get them for you. Or you can always contact helpdesk at helpdesk.ecc.edu. It's very important that you are able to access your email and that you're able to access Blackboard and MyECC for this class. It is very difficult to pass this class, if not impossible, without access to those resources. So, now that I've told you a little bit about the class and how it'll work, I can give you a sense of what we're talking about this week. We are going to be reading quite a bit of Plato in this class. Plato is the first systematic Western philosopher. He was writing about 2,400 years ago, 2,300 some odd years ago, 2,360, 2,370 years ago. He was a disciple of Socrates who lived up until 399 years before the Common Era, before the birth of Christ. And that relationship between Socrates and Plato is exploited by Plato in his dialogues. Those dialogues are the product of Plato's friendship and intellectual engagement in the period of roughly, I would say, 410 BCE to about 370, 360 BCE in Athens, Greece, at the time. During this period in history, Athens is an independent city-state, meaning that it is not affiliated with any nation. So when I say Athens, Greece, I really am a little bit imprecise. Athens was an independent state at the time. It did have relationships with many of the other independent city-states of the region in what we today call Greece, what back then by the locals would have been called Hellas. And those relationships were sometimes rowdy, as you can see from the many wars that took place at that time. And they were sometimes cordial, as you can see by the amount of trade that took place at that time, both economic trade and cultural and intellectual trade. There was quite a deal of debate about many of the topics that we'll be reading about in this class during the ancient Greek philosophical Golden Age. That Golden Age lasts approximately from 500 or 600 years before Christ to about the time, about 100 years after Plato. There are different ways to carve up that historical period, and we're not running a history class, so I'm not going to focus on those. But you should be aware that there's a lot going on in history at this time. There is much in the early stages of Christianity, the late stages of the Old Testament and Judaism. There is no Islam yet. There is no Bible, no New Testament yet. There is no Christ. There is no Christianity. And as a result, we are firmly in the ancient world. But there is quite a lot of warfare, and there is quite a lot of conflict that is generating many factions and new ways of thinking about the world. There are also many questions. Science, as we know today, does not yet exist. Literature, as we know it today, is just beginning to exist. For example, the bound book, this sort of thing, the kind of thing that we engage with today when we think of books, that does not exist. The written word exists, but it's expensive, it's difficult, and most people do not know how to read. Most art is in the form of live art, live performance, and discussion. When we talk about philosophy in this period, we're talking about conversations that are taking place between people. And those conversations are sometimes recorded. And recording might be a little bit too strong, because I would guess that in many cases the conversations are edited later for effect and to sharpen up the arguments a bit. But we can say that to a large extent we have in Plato's work something of a record of the intellectual history of the period. And that allows us to understand what the Greeks were interested in, or at least what the Athenians were interested in at the time. For example, they were very interested in questions about the origins of the world. They had no way to look at the stars except with their eyes. They had no understanding really of geology. They didn't have a sense of natural history yet, meaning the history of the world as a natural entity. All of this is just background for us, but it's helpful to have a little bit of a sense of Western civilization and its development in order to understand why the Greeks were as they were. What we will be reading this first week is a dialogue by Plato, known as the Crito, C-R-I-T-O. This dialogue is very short. Most printed versions are only about 5 pages. And shows us, without much context, an image of Socrates. Plato liked to include Socrates in his dialogues, and this may be an actual record of a conversation that took place. We don't know for sure, but it might be. In this case, we find Socrates in prison, and we find him being visited on the day before his death, before his execution, by his friend Crito. Crito is here to try to convince Socrates to escape from jail. Socrates has been jailed by his fellow Athenians after a trial. The trial seems to have been a fair trial, at least as far as trials go. And it's a very interesting trial to read about, and you can read about that in Plato's Apology, which is more properly translated apologia, which means defense, basically, or explanation. And here we see the aftermath of the trial, which is Socrates in jail, and having a conversation, a very brief conversation with Crito about whether he should remain in jail or attempt to escape. Socrates at this time is 70 years of age. He has lived since 469 BCE. He has lived through the golden age of Athenian democracy and through a period of Athenian tyranny, tyranny or oligarchy, rule of the few. And we see him now contemplating the possibility of escape and considering what he should do. So, as you read the dialogue, I hope that it makes sense to you. I won't say any more than that. What I will say is not about the dialogue itself, but about what I hope you can get from it. I want you in this class to start thinking in terms of arguments. An argument is an attempt not to have a fight with somebody, but an attempt to justify something. If I tell you, for example, that the moon is made of cheese, and you question me, then I should provide an argument for it. If I can't provide a good argument, then the proposition that the moon is made of cheese should be treated suspiciously, at the very least. And we might even say that it's outright wrong or false that the moon is made of cheese, right? Why do we do that? Why do we argue? We want to be right, don't we? We want to know, and we want to be right. I believe it was Yeats who once said, "When men are right, they are no longer young." It may be that truth and righteousness or rightness is an old man's game, something that old people try in order to justify themselves and justify their lives. Maybe philosophy is an old man's game. But we will try. We will try to look for truth, and we will try to do it by the use of reason. What that means is that we will learn a little bit of logic. We will learn a little bit of argumentation. There's always a little bit of critical thinking. Critical thinking, I said, in any philosophy class. And there's always a little bit of logic in any philosophy class. One of the first things that I'll teach you in class is about the law of contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. Those laws are important in order to help us understand what it is that we're doing here and why it is that we seek the truth. And lastly, I'll close with this. Truth is always going to be controversial. Arguments are always going to be questioned. Your job is not to accept my arguments or Plato's arguments or the arguments of any of the other people that we will read in this class. Your job is, in fact, to question. Not to question blindly and not to question quickly, but to question with reason, with care, and with respect for the traditions that you'll read about. You will see and learn a tradition in Western philosophy in this class. You will receive an introduction, a thorough introduction to Western philosophy. There is much good that comes out of that tradition, but it must be questioned. It must be challenged in order for you to be a philosopher. Otherwise, you're just another follower. Good luck, and let me know if you need anything.